Hello, American literature students. The purpose of this video is to introduce to you or review with you some pretty basic terms about poetry. We're focusing on modern poetry this week and also some Harlem Renaissance poetry next week. So this video will help set up some context for both weeks. First, some advice, and this is the same advice in the reading guide, which I hope that you have handy so that you can refer to that as well through the video. First, read the poetry aloud whenever you can. Poetry is meant to be heard. If you're not comfortable reading it aloud, or if it's something really complex like The Wasteland, I encourage you to find a recording. I've posted a couple of recordings on D2L, and follow along as you listen. That's going to really help the poetry come to life for you. Secondly, look for what the poetry is revealing. I have a lot of students who've told me that poetry is intimidating because they're supposed to search for all these hidden symbols and hidden meanings. I'd rather you not look at it that way, at least not right now. I'd like for you to think about what poetry is showing us instead of what poetry is hiding from us. Poets are trying to speak to us. So as you approach the poems, think about what it's telling us and don't work too hard to try to find all these kinds of meanings under the surface. Look at what's actually on the surface. In some cases, the poetry is going to be confusing, disorienting. When T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland, he wanted us to be disoriented by it. But even so, I want you to look for what it is saying to us, what it is showing to you. All right, so let's look back to a poem from the 1800s, from the realism period. You remember this poem that was assigned in the first week? This is the first stanza from We Wear the Mask by Paul Laurence Dunbar. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes, this debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. Okay, so if you've studied rhyme schemes in poetry before, you might have noticed that this follows an A-A-B-B-A pattern. And what that means is that the first two lines, lies and eyes, rhyme. They're assigned the letter A. The third and fourth lines, guile and smile, rhyme. They're assigned the letter B. And the last line goes back to the first line. This is more of a half rhyme. Subtleties and lies would be a half rhyme or a slant rhyme, but it's also assigned the letter A. So this poem has a regular rhyme scheme. This poem also has a regular meter. It follows a regular metrical pattern through each line. In this slide, I have bolded the syllables that are stressed or accented. Okay, to understand a little bit more about accents in a line of poetry, I want to talk to you for a minute about the different kinds of metrical feet. A foot is simply a unit of measurement in a line of poetry. There are 5 kinds of feet, and each foot is made up of a combination of unstressed and stressed syllables. For today, for this week, I want to focus on the iamb. The iamb is a syllable, or is a foot that has an unstressed and a stressed syllable. Okay, and then when we count the feet in a line, that tells us whether it's monometer, 1 foot, dimeter, 2 feet in the line, trimeter, 3 feet in a line, tetrameter has 4 feet, pentameter has 5 feet, and so on. Okay, so if we put those things together, we know that the poem We Wear the Mask is written in iambic tetrameter. What that means is that there are 4 metrical feet. We wear the mask that grins and lies. And each of those feet is an iamb. The first syllable is unstressed, the second syllable is stressed. So that therefore means that the poem is written in iambic tetrameter. Poems in the 19th century, with the exception of poetry by Whitman and Dickinson, were generally scannable to a certain kind of metrical foot, to a certain kind of metrical pattern like this. Okay, now let's look to one of the poems that's assigned this week by the modern poet Robert Frost. This is the poem Design. I found a dimpled spider, fat and white, on a white heel-all, holding up a moth like a white piece of rigid satin cloth. Assorted characters of death and blight mixed, ready to begin the morning rite. like the ingredients of a witch's broth, a snowdrop spider, a flower like a froth, and dead wings carried like a paper kite. What had that flower to do with being white, the wayside blue and innocent heel-all? What brought the kindred spider to that height, then steered the white moth thither in the night? What but design of darkness to appall, if design govern in a thing so small? Okay, so each of these lines is written in iambic pentameter, meaning there are 5 iambs in each line. I found a dimpled spider, fat and white. In fact, this poem is a sonnet. A sonnet is made up of 14 lines of iambic pentameter, and we will read more sonnets next week by the Harlem Renaissance poets. In this case, the sonnet is broken into an octave with 8 lines and a sestet with 6 lines. When you read this poem again later this week, I want you to think about how this first octave is describing a situation. A white spider on a white spider holding up a white moth, presumably about to kill and eat it. And the poet is wondering in the sestet that follows what this situation means. So let's return to that poem in the discussions later this week. Some other essential terms that are in your reading guide: blank verse. Blank verse is when you have unrhymed iambic pentameter. Let's go backwards for a second. This sonnet by Robert Frost rhymes: white, blight, moth, cloth. So there's a rhyming pattern: A, B, B, A, B, B, A, and so on. But when you have unrhymed iambic pentameter, when there's a regular metrical pattern but not a regular rhyme scheme, that's called a blank verse. I want you to look for a couple of poems in blank verse this week. Free verse is what we're moving into next. The modern poets generally wrote in free verse, and free verse means poetry that is written without a regular rhyme scheme and without a regular metrical pattern. There might be rhyming engaged somewhere in the poem, and there's certainly a rhythm to it, but there's no pattern of rhyme, no regular pattern, and no regular pattern of meter either. Imagism is a kind of poem that we'll be looking at this week. There are a few poems assigned by Imagist poets who are trying to paint a very concise, precise image in a concise, short, compressed way. Look for more about Imagism in your reading guide. Okay, so when we read The Wasteland, we're moving into it, as I mentioned earlier, into free verse, into a very different kind of poetry from what Paul Laurence Dunbar was writing in We Wear the Mask. The opening lines of The Wasteland: April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. You can hear that there's no regular metrical pattern and no regular rhyme scheme here. So this is free verse. Later in that first part of The Wasteland are these lines 19 through 21. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images. Before you read the entire poem, or before you look at it a second or third time, I want you to think about maybe these lines as the center of the poem. The poet here, the speaker, is asking what might grow out of the stony rubbish. This is hearkening back to these opening lines, right? The dead land, dull roots are stirring in this dead land. Here again is this repetition of stony rubbish. Are roots growing in this stony rubbish? And then there's the suggestion that we might not know, for we only know a heap of broken images. I want you to consider that idea of broken images as you read the whole poem. And we'll talk more about that in our discussions. Okay, so some reminders for The Wasteland, and these are also in your reading guide. Again, this poem is meant to be disorienting. It's written in fragments. The speakers change, the settings change. I want you to think about how that shifting affects the way that you read the poem and how it might even contribute to the meaning of the poem. Think about the modernist themes that we talked about last week. Review the video and reading guide from last week if you need to, and think about how those themes might be at work in The Wasteland as well. And don't forget resources. As I mentioned earlier, there is a link to a really good recording of the poem being read. I encourage you to listen to that and read along. There's also a couple of extra links under D2L extra resources for you. Okay. This week, I've been emphasizing The Wasteland because that's the longest and most challenging of the poems, but make sure that you read all of the assigned poems. Some of them are very short and very concise and will seem like a breeze compared to The Wasteland. Use your reading guide for all of those. Don't forget to ask questions. It is okay to be confused, and it's okay to ask questions. In some cases, you will ask questions that I myself might not be able to answer. There are scholars who've studied The Wasteland for decades who aren't able to answer all the questions about it, who still have questions of their own. But when you have a question about any of these poems, don't hesitate to ask on the discussion boards. Again, read aloud or listen as you read, and look for what the poem reveals. Don't exhaust yourself trying to find hidden meanings. Focus for this week on what the poems are telling you, what you know for sure. Okay, that's all I have for you. I hope you have a great week reading. Let me know if you have any other questions, and I'll see you on discussions.